My name is Henry Shank, also known as Butch, and I'll explain that why in a moment. I was born on September 12, 1945. It was the end of World War II. I was born to two German immigrant parents who had been living in the U.S. for quite a few years before that. When I was born, they weren't expecting another boy. They already had three sons, quite a bit older than me. And for whatever reason, they thought they were going to have a girl. So when I was born, they didn't have a name picked out. So when the nurse brought me in back to my mother, they said, "Here's your Butch." And that's how the name Butch stuck ever since. About a week later, they came up with the name Henry. I have no idea why they made me Henry. As a side to that, my three brothers originally all had German first names. It was Wilhelm, Friedrich, and Johannes. After the war broke out, they all changed their names to Bill, Fred, and John. But I was Henry. I was never Heinrich. I was born in New Jersey, Montclair, New Jersey. It was Mountainside Hospital, I believe. My parents' name was, my father was Hans, and my mother's name was Emily. Her full name was Emily Wilhelmina Katrina Friedrich Schenk, or Vassold, excuse me. Her maiden name was Vassold. Sounded like old fossil. But anyhow, like I said, all my brothers were considerably older than me. The oldest brother was like, gosh, it was 1929. I was 15. He was almost 17 years older than me. My other two brothers were like 11 and 12 years older than myself, so. And again, Bill, the oldest, he was away in the service when I was, shortly after I was born, not too many years later. An interesting childhood growing up. As I said, I was born at the end of World War II to German parents. Of course, there's a lot of mixed feelings about that at the end of the war. It could be difficult at times. Unfortunately, my dad passed away in 1950 when I was 5 years old, so I really never got to know him that well. I know he had kind of had a reputation as a good time Charlie. He was typical German. He liked his beer. And I remember the stories as I got older about him. He worked for General Electric at that time before he passed away. And he used to ride a motor scooter, a little old, I don't know what it was, a Vespa or something. And he'd come home from the pub, and our driveway was very steep, and he'd have to circle the street 2 or 3 times to get the speed up to make it up the driveway. And you could hear, and the neighbors would hear going, rum, 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 and then, oh, Hans is home. They could hear him going up the driveway to get into the house. And that's one of the reasons, that's one of the stories that sticks in my mind. After he passed away, it was tough for my mom. Up until that time, she really didn't have a permanent job, a regular job. He kind of discouraged that. He didn't like the idea. So, and my brothers were still home for another 4 or 5 years. In about 1955 and 56, they all got married at the same time, and she couldn't maintain the house. She couldn't maintain the house on her own, so we had to move out of the area. And it was quite a shock for a 10-year-old at that time. We moved from a pretty nice suburban area to a city in a little basement apartment, just my mother and I. And it's a big difference for a kid. That's when I experienced my first. I was born with a problem with my right hand, and that didn't come as any surprise when you look back on it. My mother was 45 years old when I was born. She was probably a little over, not much over 5 feet tall. She was pre-diabetic, and that's probably what led to this. But as a consequence of it, there was no political correctness back in those days, so kids would be kids. It wasn't too unusual for me to get picked on, but it's something I wouldn't tolerate. As I guess as you call them bullies nowadays, they found out very quickly that I wouldn't tolerate it. When I first moved into our apartment in Orange, New Jersey, where my mother and I moved, I stepped out the door and these two kids are waiting for me. Like, they knew I was there, and they jumped me. They literally jumped me. That was that's my introduction to Orange, New Jersey at the time. Next time I saw him was down in a parking lot. This is kind of a funny story. I was riding my bike, and these same two kids, the one kid was pushing his buddy in a shopping cart. He was in the shopping cart, and they saw me riding my bike, and they threw a shoe at me and hit me in the back of the head. Well, I threw my bike down. I walked over to the shopping cart, and I tipped it over and threw the kid on the ground. Then I think I probably did something to him, kicked him or something. And I didn't have any more problems with those two, although there was some resentment there. But anyhow, yeah, I guess that partly contributed to some of my attitude. I guess I was kind of a bossy and defensive kid. I would never harm anybody. And if I saw some other kid getting picked on, I was the first one there to try to stick up for him. There's a story there, too. I had a friend that I befriended right there in that neighborhood. His name was Alfred Anzalone. He was, I guess, the grandson or maybe even a great-grandson of these two Sicilian people who were quite old. They didn't speak any English. And I don't even know what his story was, why he was living there with these elderly people. And we got to be very good friends. We were in the same elementary school together, in the same class. And we were very close. And unfortunately, it was my first experience. Well, it wasn't my first experience after my father passed away. My mother took a job as an au pair, I guess you could call it, at Lake Apatcon, New Jersey, for a rather well-to-do Jewish lady who had a son about my age who didn't particularly like me. He kind of wanted to make very clear I was a servant to him. But anyhow, we were there for that summer. When I came back, the first place I went was to Alfred's house to see how he was. And when I say I'm back, and his grandparents because they couldn't speak English, all I got out of the grandmother was, "Alfred, he's dead. He's dead." And she started crying. And I was just devastated, absolutely devastated. I walked the next 4 or 5 blocks back to my house. I was just bawling like a baby. I never could get over it. And to this day, I don't know what happened to him. I have no idea why. Because he was only, 11, 12 years old maybe? So that's one thing I'll never forget. And it wasn't the first one like that, the second one like that either. So.
And how old were you then?
I guess it was 6th grade. What is that, 11 years old. Yeah, something like that. I don't know. We were typical kids, maybe before that age. I mean, we played cowboys and Indians and hide and seek and stuff like that. I don't know, dodgeball was big. I had some pets. I had a little scruffy dog named Peanuts that I had for many, many years after that. In fact, I still had her when we got married. That's how old she was. Yeah, and I got her in probably 1956, 57. Didn't get married to 10, 11 years later. So, I mean, we were young when we got married.
So what kind of chores did you have as a child, and what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, when I was a child, a young child, again, that same time frame when I was about 11 years old, and my mom, of course, she was taking whatever job she could because she had no real training. She was working in a 5 and 10, I believe. So frequently I would do some basic cooking that I had to do. So, spaghetti, what little I knew was like put pasta in boiling water and stuff like that. I remember one incident where we had absolutely nothing in the house but dried pasta. I think she had one tomato, big tomato, which I chopped up as best I could. I had no idea what I was doing. And made some kind of sauce out of it, I guess. But I remember times were kind of tough, but you manage, you get by. You look for things to improve. I always wanted to be an automobile designer, and I got that from my brother, John, who started out as a mechanic. Initially, I think it was Belleville Nutley Buick, And then he went to work for an imported car dealer who actually raced sports cars, amateur car racing. And my brother would work in the pit area, and he took me along, and I really got into car racing. And it's funny, his wife, her father was big into it as well, and they had the money. He always had a different car practically every year, a sports car. And he used to get these magazines called Autocar, which were from England, and they used to get passed on to me. And I used to read them from cover to cover, so I even developed kind of an understanding of the British form of grammar and everything else, even as an 11, 12-year-old kid. And I really got into that for the longest time. And ultimately, I wanted to become a car designer and stylist, and I did a great deal of drawing. In that respect, I was very introspective, and I spent a lot of time drawing and designing things.
Tell me about the time you got in big trouble and how your parents handled it, what kind of discipline they used when you misbehaved.
Well, I never experienced any corporal punishment. Well, my father, like I said, passed away when I was 5. My mother never spanked me. Her big thing was, God will get you for that. That was a quote. God will get you for that. And I always to this day believed it, and I still believe it. And I've actually had a couple of incidences where something like that seemed to occur. I remember this was many years later when Kathy, my wife, got sick, and we were going back and forth frequently for her to go to therapy and all. I got angry at something, and I said something that was blasphemous, shall we say, and instantly I got a blowout in my car, a flat tire, bam, and boom, 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 pulled over to the side of the road, and I was like, oh God forgive me for that. It was like slapped right that and there, and that isn't the first time that's happened to me, and I've always lived with that, which is a good thing. I attribute that to my mother.
Share some of the most cherished memories of your parents or grandparents.
My parents.
Or siblings.
My siblings. Well, I said, I guess I was very close to my brother John, who was the next to the oldest, and he always seemed to be looking out for me, again, because I was being raised without a dad. And he's quite religious and a churchgoer. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the other folks, but they had their own lives to lead and weren't necessarily available as John was, and I always appreciated that as well. My father was from what became East Germany many years later. It was Prussia, I guess, is what it was. And he came to the U.S. in 1912, if you can even believe that or not. He was only, at the time, by my calculations, 19 years old. He came with one of his sisters. I believe he was the first in his family to immigrate to the U.S. I still have his papers, as I do have my mother's as well, and it shows that the definition they had was a tinkerer, and by today's standards, he was a mechanic, an automobile mechanic, and that's what he did. And eventually, he got very successful at it. He owned his own shop, did very well. Eventually, in the 1920s, he had his own house built, again, in a nice suburban area. He had a very nice boat that I have pictures of somewhere. And him and his buddies used to go out on the Passaic River drinking beer. They ultimately rammed it and sank it with apparently no casualties, but they sank the boat. So many people after that, in the end of the 1920s, the Depression apparently ended his business career. He lost his business, and they had a struggle ever since after that. He eventually went to work as a traveling mechanic for General Electric, repairing trucks on the road. In fact, that's when he had his heart attack in 1950. That's what he was doing when he passed away. My mom came to the U.S. quite a bit later. It was 1927. The story goes, I don't know how true this is, I have a picture of her with some man side by side who I have no idea who it is. Stories go that he was some wealthy South American of German descent. and they were going to get married, but somehow she ended up marrying a mechanic from from Germany instead. And I think they met because she came over and she was, again, as an au pair, taking care of other people's kids. Somehow they met each other.
So what was the best advice and lessons you learned and taught by your parents and grandparents?
I think to be honest, to be hardworking, and be reliable and faithful, and be true to your family, of course, and do what you have to do. And that's it, I think. Do what you have to do. And never lose sight of that fact. I have a little story to tell about, this occurred around 1937, I believe. My mom and her sister-in-laws, my dad's sisters, excuse me, they opened up a trolley car restaurant in Newark, New Jersey. And I don't think it lasted very long. The story that I always remember being told was one day they came in, they turned the gas jets on for the burners, for the cookers, but apparently somebody forgot that they had turned them on, and when they ultimately lit them, they blew all the windows right out of the place, knocked some people off the stools. They never talked about anybody being hurt, which I can't imagine, but needless to say, that was the end of that business. I still have the restaurant license framed in my kitchen from that establishment. Which I always thought was a cute story.
Yeah. Let's move on to your education then.
Okay. Well, it's relatively brief. In school, particularly through grammar school, I could be an honor student 1 month or one marking period, and I could also be a truant. Because again, I didn't have the greatest attitude towards some other people. I wouldn't tolerate any kind of bullying or anything of that nature. I enjoyed reading tremendously. I picked up on things very quick, and again, as I said, I got a number of occasions where I was listed on the honor roll, but then there were other times where I'd hear a knock on the door when I was at home doing something, probably reading or working on drawing something, drawing cars, and the knock on the door would be a truant officer. So that's pretty much went right through up into high school. And I had a couple of occasions where I was elected president of the class, but it wasn't. I was never really comfortable in school, so I didn't go beyond that. And I always find this as a motivation. While I was in high school, I did go to more than one high school because we moved again because my mother taking jobs. I had a guidance counselor in high school. I still remember her name. It's funny how you remember the negative things. Her name was Mrs. Perry, and she basically looked at me and told me, well, I guess she brought up the fact that I had a truancy problem and whatever, that because of my condition, my hand, I could never do blue-collar work. I'd have to continue on after high school into college, which I took as an offense. I said, I'll prove you wrong. So the first job I accepted was a factory job, just to make a point. And it was in George Lamont and Sons in Nutley, New Jersey. It was a paper mill, basically. And the reason I got that job is my oldest brother, Bill, worked there. And I guess he got me the interview, which I had. Obviously, I did okay with it because they hired me. Didn't seem bothered by my use of one arm. And I proved myself very adequate to the point where they offered me a promotion to a new plant they were building in Burlington, Iowa. And since I was not a big fan of New Jersey at the time, unlike my wife, who is still a big fan of New Jersey, I was more than willing to escape New Jersey and go to Burlington, Iowa. Good news was it led to better things. The bad news is I couldn't stand living in the Midwest. I did turn into an alcoholic, I believe. I always did my job, But after that, I'd always go to the local pub and have my fill. So we basically, and I took my mother with me at that time, and my family was not happy with me taking her out of state. So anyhow, we were there basically for a year to the day, and I said, that's it, I'm out of here. Again, my other brother Fred lived in Maryland at the time. He offered to try to get me a job down there in Maryland, and I accepted that, and we were out of Iowa quickly. And as it turns out, it was probably one of the best moves I ever made. Again, he got me an interview with the Department of Public Works in Prince George's County, Maryland. They gave me a math test, which I was always good at, geometry and algebra. And basically the test was for a surveyor's assistant. And I did ace that very well. So they hired me. I wasn't sure what kind of job I was applying for. Turns out it was an office job. As an engineering aide was a title, and working a counter. And it was in the permit section that issued permits for new construction on public property and land developers and things of that sort. And ultimately, I was there for 4 or 5 years. And eventually, of course, I got married, which is another whole story, obviously, and raising a family. I wasn't happy with the income. I used to read the papers. I learned that Fairfax County, Virginia was a very wealthy county at the time and growing like crazy. I saw an ad one day for an engineering position over there. Although the only experience I had, I didn't have any education in it. And I applied for it, and I got it. And that ultimately led to where I was, up to the point where I retired, and I was very fortunate. I ultimately had a position where I was supervising professional engineers and attorneys, and allows me to have a decent income to this day. And I'm very grateful for it. And I'm particularly grateful to the people who helped me along the way tremendously.
Did you have some teachers from your educational days, high school or beyond there, that helped prepare you for those careers?
Yes, I still remember a lady named Mrs. Butler from my 5th grade, and I think I may have had her again in 6th grade or 7th grade. She was extremely nice and accepting. She was very encouraging, despite me being, like I said, tendency to skip school on occasions. She's one of them. I can think of some others. I remember Mr. Montgomery, who was a math teacher in high school, and he really encouraged me. I always appreciated that, and I remember his name to this day. So that was at East Orange High. Well, the biggest thing I remember, and it was a day that I was skipping school and I was home designing cars, at least in my imagination. And the news came on the radio that John F. Kennedy had been shot, John F. Kennedy. And it really devastated me. Like, can this happen in this country? And I remember, I don't know if I even have it anymore. I used to have it for a long time. I drew a picture of a rocking chair and the date. I guess he used the rocking chair quite a bit. I don't know why. But I remember doing a pen and ink drawing of that because I was really into art at that time. And that thing always stuck in my mind. There's another thing that was interesting. I can remember pretty much the date. Again, it was around the early 60s, and that was the beginning of there was the Civil Rights Movement, and Martin Luther King, of course. And I remember following that because I was an avid follower of the news. And at that time, we were living in East Orange, New Jersey, my mother and I. On Arlington Avenue, as a matter of fact. And just first time I got a glimpse of my future wife. And the reason for that is they had recently come up from Georgia, because my wife, her mother, and her brother, because her mother had recently separated and been divorced, and she came back to New Jersey because she couldn't tolerate living in the Deep South. But anyhow, the story I'm trying to connect with the current events was, like I said, there was things going on as the Spruce Springsteen song, I think, there's a line in there about there was trouble between the blacks and the whites. I don't remember that personally in my neighborhood too much because there wasn't much of that going on, and it was a very diversified neighborhood in the East Orange with blacks and whites and Italians and Irishmen and everything else. And a couple Germans, maybe me. I don't know anybody else. But anyhow, I'm sitting out on the front stoop of my apartment, which you did in those days, and I was a teenager, and I was smoking a cigarette, which was pretty common at the time as well. And I hear this commotion coming down the sidewalk, and I look off to my side, and here's this little 10, 11, 12-year-old girl, I don't know, I guess she was about 12, 13, and she's running for her life like she was anyhow. And there's a group of little black girls chasing her, and they were about the same age, and they were chasing her. And I don't know what they were saying, I don't remember, but they were chasing her down, and they ran by me. And I'm just looking, watching this. Short time later, I hear the noise again, the commotion. Now they're running towards me in the other direction, and the girls, the little bunch of girls, they're running, and my future wife, as it turns out, is chasing them with a broken bottle. And they ran right by me. And I kind of stuck on my mind and said, that girl's got spunk. I kept that in my mind. And yeah, that was Kathy Hillier, now Kathy Schenk, my wife of 53 years. And that was the first time I saw her. Ultimately, and there was a reason for that. Let me clarify something. Her brother, who was closer to my age, which almost 5 years older than her, he was, of course, they just moved up from the South, like I said. He was a very proud Confederate. And he hung a giant Confederate flag on the third-floor apartment bedroom window. And you don't do that. I mean, that kind of incites the neighborhood, especially when you're living in New Jersey, okay? So it was understandable why they were probably chasing her. They knew who she was. I don't know. Fortunately, no harm came of it, so anyhow. During that time, I did make friends with her brother, in spite of our differences of opinion, and he ultimately became a Green Beret and a decorated veteran in the Vietnam War. Was injured twice, went back. We went back to Nam the second time to get away from a very bad marriage. He volunteered to go back, but that's another story. But anyhow, in the interim from that time, that incident, in a couple of years, I took the job out in Iowa. Like I said, it didn't last very long, and so I was kind of out of touch with them. When I came back, I ultimately connected up with her brother again, and Kathy, and ultimately we started dating later on, and we were married at a young age. Well, she certainly was. She was only 17, just barely 18. Didn't have, excuse the expression, but the Irish say we didn't have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. So it was a tough start. But again, we were both pretty determined kids, so we did what we had to do. And ultimately, we ended up in Maryland, like I said earlier. I guess for a while there, that's right. I was actually commuting from Maryland up to New Jersey to see her. We didn't get married. We didn't get married right away. True story about that too. I remember when we were dating, I went up to New Jersey to see her, and I have a horrible sense of direction. And she had to do something. She was in the car. I dropped her off, and I said, "I'll be back for you. I'm going to go around the corner." And when I came around the corner, I got lost. I couldn't find her. I always remember that. I literally going around the corner, I got lost, and I couldn't find her. And I think she walked home. I don't know what the story was. But we got married in the Catholic Church. My buddies from the old Jersey days, in particular, took me out to a bachelor party that night. Bachelor party, I think it was at the bar in the bowling alley. But I had too much to drink. So at my wedding in the Catholic Church, and I didn't know anything about the Catholic Church, I remember my best man was an old Irishman. His name was Dennis Brady. He was Catholic. And I was supposed to kneel, and I think I got down in a three-quarter stance like a football player because I I still hadn't sobered up. And he's saying, no, that's not how you do it. He was trying to tell me how to kneel, and I was literally in a three-point stance. And as far as the reception, it was in her mom's apartment building, mom's apartment house, or apartment. That was it. That was the wedding reception. The honeymoon was at the Evergreen Motel in East Orange, New Jersey for one night. That was the honeymoon. Yes, we have 2 children. We have a son, James, Jimmy, we call him Jimmy or Jim. And we have a daughter, Dawn. And I'm not sure what. James is a very common name in my mother, in my wife's family. Her father was, her father was James Hilliard II. Her brother was James Hilliard III. She has a nephew, the 4th, and a great nephew, the 5th. So it's no surprise she wanted to name our son, the oldest, James. So I don't know where that came from. Now Dawn, I don't know. She had a friend, I think, with that name, and it was a pretty common name. Not common, but at the time, 1968, when Dawn was born, it was a pretty common name for girls. But anyhow, they're, of course, parents now of their own. We have 5 grandchildren combined between the 2 of them. All great kids. I have the oldest grandson, Kyle. He's at Virginia Tech. He's in his 5th year of RTC. He graduates next year and goes into the military, I guess, as a 2nd lieutenant. And his brother just started this year at Virginia Tech, and they both seem to like it very much. My other 3 grandchildren, Jim's kids, 2 girls and a boy. That's Lisa, Clara, and William. Of course, they all live in Indiana, and we don't get to see them that much for that very reason. Jim had a career in journalism. That's what he went to school for. Dawn got her law degree, and she went on to become a deputy commissioner of the Social Security Administration. And as a matter of fact, she married a lawyer. My son used to tease me about it when they used to study together. He called them, they were lawyers in love. They were doing more than studying when they were sitting at the table together, studying. But they've done very well. The big thing is when my kids were in college, well, after college too, my wife and I both had pretty good jobs, good paying jobs. And the first thing I should point out is Kathy graduated from nursing school. She went to nursing school while the kids were growing up. I would babysit. They were about 8 and 9 years old when she started, and she successfully completed that and became an emergency room nurse. It's a job she loved very much, and she was a bit of an adrenaline junkie. She loved the action and everything. But anyhow, we were fortunate to do a lot of traveling when the kids were getting out of college, and that was in the mid to late 80s. And we went everywhere. We went to Mexico and Central America on a number of occasions. We loved that a lot. There's some great pictures of that. We went to Europe, including Germany and Belgium and Switzerland. I love Switzerland. It was a beautiful place. We really got into the British Isles. She became a big fan of the Brits. Spent a lot of time going over there, going to Scotland, and made a lot of friends there. We were invited to a couple weddings over there, some of which I have pictures of. We were very fortunate to be able to do that. I worked a lot of crazy hours. I accumulated a lot of leave that I could use. I was appreciative, very glad I had that opportunity. She would work per diem. That's the way she wanted it, because I was the one that was carrying all the benefits to do that. She worked for straight pay, and we had a good time. And it was kind of fortuitous because she always said, "Let's do it while we can," which proved to be very true, because in 2000, Kathy suffered from a brain hemorrhage that killed most people. But I always joke about she's too ornery to die. She wouldn't put up with that. I mean, it was massive. Most people are gone before they hit the floor. But she had a wonderful doctor, surgeon, who she actually worked with at one time, and that's who she insisted on having. She actually called me from Washington, D.C., where she was working, and said, "Hon, you got to come down. I'm in the hospital." And I drove down there from Fairfield, Pennsylvania to D.C. in about an hour. And yeah, but she was conscious enough to tell him, and this might have hurt her in the end. She said, "I want to go to George Washington University Hospital. I want Dr. Anthony Caputi to work on me." And unfortunately, that hospital she was in didn't do anything for like an hour, hour and a half. And of course, she was suffering a brain bleed, which did a lot of damage. But yeah, Kathy went through extensive rehabilitation. She was basically paralyzed on the right side of her body, which she still is to this day. She has trouble. She understands everything, but she has trouble speaking, and she has trouble communicating, and even reading to some extent. She understands everything. So I realized I had to do some. Here's a story I tell everybody. Kathy was an excellent cook. She enjoyed cooking herself in spite of these ridiculous hours at work she spent. And sometimes when she did do that at work, I would kind of finish it up when we came home. I'd finish up whatever she started. So I knew a little bit. And I did a lot, like most guys, I did a lot of barbecuing outside and stuff. But anyhow, when she got sick, I realized if I wanted to continue to eat in the manner to which I was accustomed, I'd better learn how to cook. And that's exactly what I tell people. So I did. And one of the things she enjoyed very much when she was recovering for months and months, she used to love to watch the cooking channel, the Food Network. And I watched it with her, and that helped me as well, considerably, because that's what we watched all when we were home. But I learned to cook. I read a lot of the books, and I enjoyed it. I actually enjoyed it. I liked the challenge, came up with a lot of new things. At that time, my brothers were still alive, and they would come every weekend. They'd alternate to help us as she was going through a recovery and all, and helping me. And I wanted to feed them when they were here. So that gave me plenty of opportunity. And that was great. That was great. That went on for a couple of years, maybe, with John and Fred, my two remaining brothers. Bill passed away just before 2000. And that's how I started. And then I think about that. I think it might be a bit hereditary. Because remember, I said the story about my mom and her sister-in-law running that restaurant that they blew up, the diner. And another thing, I've done a little research into family history, at least on the Schenk side, my father's side. And actually the name Schenk, and I saw this when I was visiting Germany, the name Schenk, we pronounce it Schenk. In German it's Schenke, but my family never pronounced it that way. They always just said Schenk. Anyhow, what it literally means is server or provider. It can even mean like a publican, a person who runs a pub. And if you go back in the history of the name, that the first person that actually had the written name Schenk, he ran a pub back in the 1100s and something. So yeah, his name was Berthold Schenke. So who knows? Maybe it is in my genes. I don't know. I don't know.
Tell me what some of your proudest moments as a parent and the grandparent were.
Well, certainly as a parent, the graduation of both of my kids from university. Something I didn't do, but they did both graduate. The grandkids growing up, and like I said, my oldest grandson is on his way to becoming an officer in the Army, graduating from Virginia Tech. We did a lot of babysitting. My wife, my daughter still makes jokes about this, was the oldest. The first one's always kind of, especially with her. She would literally come and kidnap him, the baby, from the babysitter. She'd take off from work and she'd go get Kyle, and we'd go do something with him. And that was pretty frequent. My daughter used to kid about that and make jokes. She was paying his babysitter whether they had the baby or not. That's how it was. And it was similar with Colin, the next oldest. She did stuff like that with him as well. So, yeah.
You talked a little bit about your vacations and traveling. And how about places you've lived and your favorite place to live and why?
Well, I think right where we are in Fairfield. We love it here. It's beautiful. The people in this community are wonderful. They're very down to earth. They're sincere. There's no pretense. They are what they are, and I really enjoy that. Just great people. We knew about this area 20 years ago, probably 20 years before we ever moved here. We always said this is where we wanted to retire. The reason we knew about it is because we have a favorite place we used to go to, or still in touch with, a bed and breakfast called Hickory Bridge Farm. And we always used to spend weekends there, and first every opportunity we got, we would drive up from Maryland. Eventually we had my family and their friends come. We'd have groups as many as 15 or 16 people, and we'd take over the entire bed and breakfast. Literally took every room and spend the weekends there, and we did that quite a bit. So eventually, and we got to know the family that ran the bed and breakfast, Hickory Bridge Farms, and to this day, the daughter of the couple that started it, the doctor and his wife who actually started that business, my wife Kathy and her, Mary Lynn Martin, they still have a girls' day out every month, and they go get their hair done, and they go to a restaurant, and they do shopping to this very day, which is, it's remarkable. It's typical, again, of this community.
Let's talk about summarizing. I noticed you had as the core values that you think have really made you who you are and have brought you to this point in life, where being creative and inventive, being a hard worker, loyalty, and conscientious. And you've added fortitude and tenacity. So have those all served you well, and do you know of any specific stories that might have applied to that?
No, I think those are the things that they certainly always motivated me, and treating people fairly and honestly, and including as a supervisor and mentor to other people who worked for me. I think it worked out. I have a thing I remember is a few years ago I went back down to Fairfax to attend a retirement party for one of the ladies that worked with us, and I got a very nice reception. I was surprised some of them even remembered me, because it was like 17 years after I retired or more, I don't know. But anyhow, another one of the ladies that was there, and this is funny because she introduced me and she said that I was the best boss she'd ever had. And I distinctly remember at the time her coming into my office once in a while in a huff saying, "We're all doomed, this is happening or that's happening." And she always made the remarks that my problem was I only look for the best in people. Which I learned at a later age. Like I said, I was kind of a cocky teenager. I had a bit of chip on my shoulder and attitude, but somewhere along the line, probably in my early 20s, I learned from people that you just can't do that all the time. You got to, but it's true. In that time, I did feel like that. I always looked for the best in people, but I remember her kind of chastising me for that, and here she is, so many years later, telling me I was the best boss she ever had. So that was nice. It was great,
I know you mentioned your biggest challenge was Kathy's illness.
Yeah, no question.
The happiest moments throughout your life and how?
Well, in large part, it's got to be her. I mean, look what she's dealt with, And anybody who knows her, and they always make the comment that she amazes them because it doesn't slow her down. She has the use of one arm and one leg. She zips around in a wheelchair, bouncing off the walls sometimes. But it doesn't hinder into her. She has more, and she still has more energy than a lot of people younger than her who can't begin to do what she does.
To sum it all up, how do you want your life to be remembered by those who watch you and listen to your story?
I think I'd like to be remembered again for being considerate of other people, appreciative of their lives as well. I appreciate all those that served as mentors to me, gave me opportunities that I had. And I do believe that when you're given an opportunity like that, you should take full advantage of it. You don't accept it like it's some kind of rite of passage. I mean, you've got to earn it. And you got to stay focused. And you have a family. Family comes first, and you got to take care of them no matter what. That's pretty much it.